So you've talked a lot about how this is in the United States' interest, but why should other countries have any interest in the U.S. throwing its weight around?
Well, the remarkable thing that I've seen these last 3.5 years, and actually these last 30 years, having the incredible privilege of going around the world, helping to represent the country, is that we're almost inevitably the port of first call for countries around the world, even countries with which we have significant disagreements, when some challenge or some problem emerges. Because even when we have disagreements on particular policies, there is an extraordinary attractiveness to the United States that most other countries don't have. Whether it's our education system, whether it's science and technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, people see that and they want to be part of it. The other thing that's been a hallmark of what we've done, and again, I want to emphasize, very imperfectly, we have some of the ideals that we've set for ourselves, we have the reality, and there's a gap. But, for example, with the partnerships we have, we don't do them through coercion. We don't say, if you don't sign up and join us, something bad's going to happen to you. We don't buy people off. These are, generally speaking, coalitions, collections of countries and groups that have some shared interest, and hopefully, at the heart of it's shared values that come together voluntarily, stay together voluntarily. Other big powers, that's not how they approach it. They do it through coercion, they do it through co-optation, through trying to buy people off.
So I'm hearing you say, I believe, that there is international pressure for the United States to take on the kind of role that you're talking about. And, you know, while you've been in office, is there anything that springs to mind as an example of a place where we have stepped in?
Time and again. And of course, the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2022, following its initial aggression back in 2014. We managed to see that coming. We had extraordinary intelligence that saw that coming. We shared that with the world. We got countries organized to make sure that if it happened, we were ready to respond. And that leadership, bringing together more than 50 countries in support of Ukraine to help it defend itself against the aggression, did a remarkable thing. It prevented Putin from achieving what he was trying to achieve, which was really to erase Ukraine from the map, to subsume it into Russia. That didn't happen. It won't happen. There's a reason that was so important, and a reason that countries looked to us to lead, because they knew that this wasn't simply about Ukraine, as important as that was, or the suffering of the Ukrainian people. It was also about the fact that Russia was committing aggression against some very basic principles that countries have agreed on, however imperfectly. You can't just go in and change the borders of another country by force. You can't go in and just take over your neighbor. You can't dictate to another country what its choices are. And I think there was a realization that if this was allowed to happen with impunity in this place, it was going to happen in other places. That would-be aggressors everywhere would see this and say, if they can get away with it, we can get away with it. And that's a recipe for a world of conflict that inevitably draws us in. So better to get at it ahead of time. Now, the other powerful thing with Ukraine is we've been leading, but we've been leading in ways that have others stepping up in ways that we haven't seen before. We talk about something called burden sharing. Are other countries carrying their weight? They are. As much as we've dedicated to this, our European partners in Asia, they've been dedicating even more, militarily, economically, humanitarian assistance. So we have that. And then much of the investment that we're making for Ukraine to make sure it has the defense systems it needs, actually those are investments we're making here in the United States, because it goes to our defense production, which then goes to Ukraine.
Which actually brings up something I think people don't always think about when they think about American foreign policy, and that is the power of the American economy and the sanctions that went into force almost immediately.
And that just didn't happen. It didn't just happen. It was the product of a tremendous amount of work that started well before the Russian aggression to make sure that if that aggression happened, yes, we were ready not only to help Ukraine, but to put pressure on Russia. It's not what we said. It's not what we wanted to do. You know, when President Biden took office and he had a meeting in Geneva with President Putin, we wanted, and we were testing the proposition that we could have a more stable, predictable relationship with Russia, because we had other things that we wanted to be spending our time and resources on. Unfortunately, tragically, Putin's worldview was very different, and he was determined to try to recreate something that looked like the Russian Empire. Ukraine was the the cherry on top of the cake that he was trying to get.
You know, we know a lot about Ukraine. We've been at it for a while, and the lines there are pretty clear. But, you know, what about Gaza, and what about what's happening with Israel in the Middle East?
Heather, this is one of the biggest challenges we've faced, one of the most gut-wrenching challenges we've faced because of human suffering on all sides, but also one of the most necessary challenges because addressing that also is the difference not only between ending the conflict in Gaza, but also making sure that it doesn't spread to other places and create a much bigger
Tell me
war.
more about that. You know, so one of the things that really jumped out to me at the beginning was how many times, and you can even search for it on the State Department website or the White House website, you and President Biden said to anybody thinking about extending this conflict, don't. Start with that and what the bigger picture is, and then it would be nice if we could draw it down a little bit.
So there are all sorts of other countries or groups that have looked to take advantage of the conflict in Gaza, the war in Gaza, for their own purposes and to advance their own agendas. And also because Israel has so many enemies surrounding the country that have sought its destruction from day one. Historic. This goes back.
In this case, they have not gotten involved in attacking Israel.
They haven't, and again, that doesn't happen by accident either.
Right.
It happens because, in part, we've been engaged in making very clear that if they do that, they're going to have a larger problem. And we've brought other countries together in that proposition. Let me give you some quick examples. First, of course, we've had a very challenging situation in the north, which is to say the border between Lebanon and Israel. And there's a group, Hezbollah, which we consider a terrorist group that dominates the southern part of Lebanon.
They're non-state actors.
And they're non-state actors. So this is important because dealing with non-state actors is an even more complicated piece of business.
That would be something that goes back to your idea of creating representative partnerships to deal with, is the rise of non-state actors.
This is one of the biggest developments over the last 20, 25 years that we've had to account for. So you have Hezbollah that says, as long as this conflict in Gaza is going on, we're going to fire rockets into Israel in response. The result of firing those rockets into Israel has meant that somewhere around 60 or 70,000 Israelis who live in the north of Israel have had to move out of their homes and move out of the north, and you have a part of the country that's been virtually depopulated. It also risks starting a much bigger war. And this is something that from day one, we have wanted to do everything we can to prevent, to avoid. So through our diplomacy, through our own military presence as a deterrent in the region, through making sure that Israel has what it needs to effectively defend itself, we've helped ward that off.
Which means not only weaponry, but also intelligence and sort of a blanket approach to information and to the sort of things you would need to counter a non-state actor,
That's
for
right.
example. Okay.
You have another group in Yemen, a group called the Houthis, another sub-state group, non-state group, although it has the desire to take over and run the entire country of Yemen, that also got into the act. And in the Red Sea, which is where so much commerce travels every single day, has been attacking shipping from all sorts of countries.
Including, if I'm correct, the grain that goes to Africa.
Grain that goes to Africa, indeed, that even goes to Yemen itself. So this is a food issue, and this is how all of these things are so connected. Just as the Russian aggression against Ukraine disrupted food supplies from Ukraine to the rest of the world, Ukraine was a breadbasket for the rest of the world. So too, disrupting traffic in the Red Sea, that's disrupted food, that's disrupted all sorts of products that people rely on every day from moving around. So we've worked to try to keep the Houthis at bay and make sure that they were not disrupting shipping to the extent that they wanted to. And there are a number of other places in Iraq, in Syria, where groups have tried to use or thought about using the fact of this horrible conflict in Gaza to their own advantages to start something else. And we've been working overtime to make sure that that doesn't happen, that this conflict doesn't spread, that it doesn't escalate. But Gaza itself, after the events of October 7th, the most barbaric slaughter that one can imagine of innocent civilians, of course, Israel had to be able to defend itself, to try to make sure that what happened on October 7th couldn't happen again. But it's also been so important that the way they do that comes into account. And making sure that civilians, children, women, men in Gaza, who had nothing to do with October 7th, but have been caught in a crossfire of Hamas's making, the group that attacked Israel, that knew that it was going to provoke a huge response, that these people are protected, that they get the assistance that they need so that they can survive. That's been a struggle and one that we've been engaged in also from day one. But as you know better than anyone, because everything you do is grounded in history, there's a long story here that goes back to the creation of the State of Israel, an agreement that was made at the United Nations, where you had two people who were fighting over the same piece of land. Decision was made to basically divide it up. In that moment in time, Arab countries rejected the division. The Jews accepted it. There were wars. Ultimately, Arabs came around to acknowledging and accepting the existence of Israel. Decades later, Egypt made peace, Jordan made peace, others. And then the question was, could we find a solution between the Israelis and Palestinians, particularly making sure that Palestinians had the state to which they were entitled. And, to simplify history, many proposals were made that actually would have given the Palestinians virtually everything that they were looking for. They, in those moments, 2000, Camp David with President Clinton. Some years later, with an Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, they were not able to say yes to what was on offer. But then, in recent years, Israelis probably believing that the status quo that they had, including their ongoing presence in the West Bank, that was something that would be a status quo you could sustain forever. That took over, and so there was no movement on actually creating a Palestinian state. And that worked until it failed catastrophically, including in Gaza. So the real challenge now, besides ending this war, this conflict, in a way that ensures Israel's security, is to find an answer to this more fundamental challenge. You have about 5 million or so Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza who are not going anywhere. You have maybe 7 million Jewish Israelis who are not going anywhere. There has to be an enduring accommodation that will let these two peoples live side by side in peace, in security, because in the absence of that, this cycle, one way or another, is just going to repeat itself. So the United States, historically and in this moment, is the country that others look to try. All of our Arab partners are looking to us. Israel looks to us. The Palestinians look to us to try to move things forward. Now, they have very different ideas about the best way to do that. We're the ones who have to try to put this together, not only to answer the immediate challenge of ending the conflict in Gaza, but also working to find a way forward that gets us to a better place. Last thing on this, we can see how that can come together. We can see how Israel can get what it's wanted from day one of its existence, which is to be part of the neighborhood, to have normal relations with other countries, including Saudi Arabia. How the Palestinians can have a state to which they're entitled, and how the actors that really want to make trouble every day, like Iran and the various groups that it funds and finances, are isolated. That's a path, and we can see it clearly. The question is how to really get on it and move down it in a decisive way.
A friend of mine always says that everybody wants the same things. We want our children to be safe, and we want food on the table and a roof over our heads and to get along with our neighbors. But the trick is reminding people that the other people have to have that before we have it as well.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're always at risk of somebody coming in and tearing it all apart.
Heather, you're exactly right. And one of the things that's gotten lost too, and we see this so profoundly in Gaza, but we also see it in our own society and in other societies. Maybe for me, the most potent poison in the common well that we have to drink from is dehumanization, is the inability, the refusal to see the humanity in someone else. When that happens, when that takes hold, your heart hardens, and things that shouldn't be possible suddenly become very possible in terms of what you're willing to do or what you're willing to accept. And then how difficult it becomes to do good things, that also takes hold. So we have to constantly find ways to push back against that, because when dehumanization sets in, everything becomes so much harder.
Thank you. Thank you for taking your time and for representing the country.
Thanks, Heather. Great to be with you. Thanks.